Hey everybody, Sarah here. I wanted to talk to you today about how to achieve a super smooth, buttery, soft, delicious, blurry background in your images. So the reason that a lot of people try to achieve this is because we have the ability as photographers to direct our viewer's eye in our images. We can point our viewers in the right direction of what we want them to look at the most in our photos. So one of the easiest ways we can do that is to actually use a shallow depth of field. And that's what you're looking for when you're trying to create a buttery, smooth background. Depth of field is basically how much of your image is going to be sharp, in focus. No matter where you focus, depth of field is actually going to expand and be greater or smaller depending on four main things. That's what I want to share with you guys today. It's super important to understand how our cameras and lenses are working, and you'll be a better photographer from knowing this. So the first one that I want to talk about is I want to talk about aperture, because aperture is usually what we think of as having the greatest effect on shallow depth of field in our images, or on any depth of field in our images. Basically, if you don't know what aperture is, an aperture is the hole that lets in light in your camera. Well, it's technically in your lens, usually. So the hole that lets in light can change in size, and the larger the hole of light coming through, the brighter your photo is going to be. Also, the shallower your depth of field is going to be. If you have a smaller hole of light coming through, you're going to have greater depth of field and less light coming through because the hole's a lot smaller. So you can see that here with this camera that I have. If I wanted to show you what it looks like when I change my aperture, right now I'm at f1.4, which is the f-stop is the aperture, f1.4, and if I move down and I'm slowly just bringing this aperture down lower, you can see that size of the hole getting smaller, and the smaller that hole, the greater the depth of field, which means the wider the hole, the shallower the depth of field. And this is really important because if you're trying to achieve a soft background, you're generally going to want a wider aperture. But remember that a wider aperture is actually delineated with a smaller number. So for instance, wide apertures are usually f2, 2.8, f4. Those are wide apertures that will create a shallow depth of field. And when you get down to those smaller apertures like f16, f22, you're going to see pretty much everything in your image sharp. Not every picture needs a shallow depth of field, but since that's what we're talking about today, you're going to want to make sure that you're at like f2 or 2.8 if you can, or f4. Okay, so aperture is super important. We want to make sure to set that wider aperture if you want a shallow depth of field. The second thing I want to talk about is I want to discuss lens choice, because lens choice also plays a huge role in this. What I mean by that is when you're photographing with a wider field of view, a wider lens, more like a 24mm lens or a 35mm lens, that wider angle of view is naturally going to create a greater depth of field. So if you are trying to achieve a shallow depth of field, generally the longer the lens, the easier it's going to be to achieve that. So for instance here, I have with me a 14mm lens. This is an extremely wide lens. It's pretty cool. This lens, if I take a picture with it, even if I'm at what is it, 2.8, that's the widest aperture I can achieve on this lens. Even if I'm at 2.8, most things in my image are actually going to look sharp because this lens is so wide that just by nature of the optics, it's going to make my image look sharp almost all the way through. So that's something you have to consider when you're photographing as well. The wider your lens is, the greater depth of field you're going to achieve. If I go up to something like this is a telephoto lens. It's a beautiful lens, a 70-200, much different than a 14. If I'm shooting with this and I'm shooting at either 70 or 200, it's so much longer than a wide field of view, and therefore my depth of field at 2.8 is going to be so much shallower just because I'm using a longer lens. It's super important to consider lens choice when you're photographing. This doesn't mean that you never can get a shallow depth of field with a wide lens, because it's totally possible, but that factors into our next two things we're going to talk about. So the third thing is you want to think about how close you are to the subject that you're photographing. If I am taking a picture of you and I come in real close and I'm right up here taking a picture, that picture is automatically going to have a blurrier background behind the thing that I focus on, because the thing I focus on is so close to my lens that, again, by nature of the optics, it's going to actually make everything behind what I focus on much more blurry, and therefore I've created a shallow depth of field even with a wider-ish lens on my camera because I'm so close to my subject. As soon as I back up and I get quite far from my subject, then I'm going to get more things in my image sharp than I would have when I was close. So again, distance to subject matters so much. So you want to think about when you're photographing, if you're closer to something, you're going to naturally get a blurrier background behind that thing you're photographing. If you're further away from something, you're going to naturally get a greater depth of field, so a less blurry background. Then your fourth thing, and this is the one that people often forget about, but it's super important, and because I'm a portrait photographer, I think about it all the time, and that is your subject's distance from the background. You might be photographing out against a brick wall somewhere, or you might be against a tree line, and there's trees behind your subject or a brick wall behind your subject, and you're trying to take a portrait that has a blurry background. If the subject is super close to the background behind them, you're going to have a really hard time taking a picture with shallow depth of field. Try to get them off that background. Have them step a few feet forward. Even like 3 feet can make a difference. Even 1 foot can make a difference. Because when you have them move further away from that background, then your focal point changes, right? Because you're going to make sure they're sharp. So you're going to focus here instead of here when they were right in front of the background, which means that as your depth of field expands a little bit, it's not going to reach the background. So your sharp zone is here now. It's not right up against the wall. So this is super important, because if you're trying to achieve that delightful blurry background, you just need to make sure that your subject is a little further from whatever is behind them, and you're going to get a much shallower depth of field. So this is super important, and I hope that it helps you guys, but basically what you want to think about is you want to have a shallower depth of field. That's the goal, and you have 4 ways you can create it. All of these can interplay and mix and change your photos in so many different ways, but these are the 4 things you've got to think about. So the first one we said is aperture. A wider aperture creates a shallow depth of field, which remember is a smaller number. The second one we talked about is lens length. So a longer lens, a telephoto lens, is going to create a shallower depth of field. Then the third one is distance from your subject. So if you're closer to them, your depth of field is going to be more shallow. And then our fourth one is your subject's distance from the background. So you want to make sure that to get them away from that background if you can, and then you'll create that buttery background you're looking for. So if you liked this video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, thumbs down. I hope that it helped you somehow. Feel free to leave any questions in the comments section below, and subscribe if you haven't already. And thanks for watching. We love you guys. Have a great day.